think the prime minister is under pressure, just as you said, from two different elements. From the families and the bulk of the Israeli population who want to see the hostages released, particularly after the shocking images of the last three to come free. The U.S. certainly wants, President Trump wants to see hostage releases continue until they're completed. But there are members of his coalition who wish to see a return to combat, regardless of the fate of the hostages. These are pressures the prime minister has been balancing, has been dealing with since this campaign began.
How serious do you think, though, that the repercussions could be?
Well, sadly, we've had many such delays. They've become a routine factor in this phase one of hostage releases, and I wouldn't overstate the consequences here. Both sides have a compelling interest. Israel in getting living hostages back and those deceased accounted for. Hamas in avoiding a return to the Israeli military campaign in keeping this going. And my estimation is, after a period of flurry, there will be a continuation of the deal. But it's very clear that the focus needs to be not just on continuing this phase, but moving from this to the so-called second phase of hostage releases, which is more than just a ceasefire. It's additional requirements that are compelled upon Israel. There are more negotiations underway right now. They've just taken place in Doha. The president's special emissary, Steve Witkoff, is engaged. And that's where I think both sides are looking. But I wouldn't overstate this present difficulty.
Yeah, and I will talk about that next phase in just a moment. But as you say, we have seen delays before. But the claim from Hamas is that Israel has been violating the deal, preventing people from getting back to their homes in northern Gaza, continuing to shell them, to fire on some of them and so on. Do you think that Hamas is justified in taking this step?
Look, Hamas is a terrorist group. It's not justified in doing anything, including the starvation and maltreatment of hostages. The images of the three just released that look very much like Holocaust survivors is an indication of what we're dealing with here. But on the substance of commitments, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been able to return to northern Gaza. Israel has withdrawn from the so-called Netzarim corridor, separating north from central Gaza, and food has been moving in sufficient quantity by humanitarian agency estimation to alleviate the risk that did exist 6 weeks ago of starvation or famine. So much has been done. The issue of shelter is a complicated one, especially prefabricated shelter in terms of mobilizing it and moving it in. But significant progress has been made on the critical issue of food as well as return of Palestinians to the north.
To try and keep this deal on track then, which you clearly believe is possible, how crucial is the role of Donald Trump, who of course has talked about the fact that actually the Palestinian people should head off somewhere else while he turns the Gaza Strip into a Riviera of the Middle East?
Well, the point I think we all need to focus on right now is the role of the U.S. in seeing to it that the second phase of hostage releases, of ceasefire, is moved into and is concluded. The president has made clear he wants to see all hostages out, not just U.S., and the deceased accounted for. That's going to require the U.S. to remain engaged, as the U.S. was engaged, both the previous administration and the incoming administration, in the negotiation of phase one. With respect to the comments on a future of Gaza, the Palestinian people of Gaza are not going to voluntarily depart in any significant numbers, nor is there a place ready to receive them were they willing to do so. Neither Jordan nor Egypt are prepared to take the political or security risks of such an occurrence. So I think we're going to be dealing with the practicalities of how do you manage a day after in Gaza, given the scope of destruction, with the Palestinian population still resident. And that's going to require a political framework.
I'm just seeing some comments from the US president who's been speaking just in the very last few minutes. And he has said that the ceasefire deal between Hamas and Israel should be cancelled if Hamas does not release all hostages by Saturday. What do you make of that intervention?
I have not seen those remarks and can't make any meaningful comment upon them. The negotiations that led to the phase one deal were complex. They were negotiations in which the Trump administration, were heavily invested, as they will need to be invested in a phase two. And I really cannot comment on what you've just read to me, except to say that keeping alive the ceasefire and continued hostage releases is critical.
Yeah, we're hearing that Benjamin Netanyahu is bringing forward a meeting of his cabinet. He's clearly under pressure, isn't he, from right-wingers who are unhappy about the deal and the release of so many Palestinian prisoners. And at the same time, of course, the families of the hostages are desperate to get their loved ones home.
I think the prime minister is under pressure, just as you said, from two different elements. From the families and the bulk of the Israeli population who want to see the hostages released, particularly after the shocking images of the last three to come free. The U.S. certainly wants, President Trump wants to see hostage releases continue until they're completed. But there are members of his coalition who wish to see a return to combat, regardless of the fate of the hostages. These are pressures the prime minister has been balancing, has been dealing with since this campaign began.
Yes, that was Donald Trump speaking just a short time ago. Do you think this is, in part, just the US president trying to keep up the pressure, trying to ensure that both sides do all they can to get back to that agreement and ensure that the next stage of the hostage release goes ahead?
I think it will be important for both sides, Hamas and Israel, to continue with the necessary steps to see that all hostages are released, including U.S. hostages, living U.S. hostages, and that those deceased are fully accounted for. That has to be the focus right now and for the immediate future.
Just finally, what do you make of that idea of Donald Trump's that actually, because Gaza, which as we know has suffered so much destruction, that the Palestinians should leave the territory, go elsewhere, though both Jordan and Egypt, which Trump mentioned, have said that they would not want to take in large numbers of Palestinian refugees. And of course, we know that for historical reasons, many of those living in Gaza are desperate not to be moved elsewhere. What do you make of that suggestion from Donald Trump about moving the Palestinian people elsewhere?
The president's observation that the destruction, the elimination of essential services in Gaza is extensive, overwhelming, is quite accurate. But in fact, despite that, the vast majority of the Palestinian population of Gaza, in the face of that destruction, regarded as their home, they are not going to be willing to be displaced voluntarily elsewhere. They'll feel they'll never be allowed back. And there are no countries in the real world in which we deal, certainly not Jordan and Egypt, which are going to be in a position for political or security reasons to voluntarily accept significant numbers of those Palestinians. A resolution will need to be found, I believe, that has them in their place in Gaza with assistance from Arab states, critical donors in terms of stabilization and reconstruction. What's the door through which that comes that day after? It's a political framework, and it's a political commitment to a resolution through negotiations of the issue of two states or permanent status. Hard, but necessary.
David Satterfield, former US ambassador, also former special envoy for Middle Eastern humanitarian affairs, also now at the Baker Institute. Great to speak to you this evening. Thank you so much.